Okay, we're going to look at some more detail of experiments. So we're going to look at simple random sampling, usually referred to as just random sampling, cluster random sampling, and stratified random sampling. In the cluster one, you divide the population into groups. So it might be city blocks. If you're in a high school, it might be areas of the school, such as the gym, the cafeteria, the lobby, places like that. And then from each of those clusters within that, you actually pick a random sample from each of those. And the subjects that you get from that way are the total sample. So it's preferable a lot of times because it's cheaper, and sometimes you don't know what the sampling frame is. Disadvantage is you usually need a larger sample size to get a good level of precision as you might by some other way. And also, if your clusters are close together, sometimes close in some sense. For instance, if I did city blocks, I might pick city blocks that are a mile from each other, but in fact they might be in the same type of neighborhood, so I get basically the same subjects from each one. That's homogeneous. So I may want to stratify this instead. So if I can have separate groups, for instance, if I be looking at high school, I might do freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. If I'm looking at population, I might do age. I might also do stratified on something like annual income. And from each of the stratum, I want to pick a random sample. I add those random samples from each of the stratum together, and that is my simple random sample total. So the advantage is you get a pretty good representation of the entire population. But you have to have some sort of sampling frame, and you have to know what stratum each subject belongs to. For instance, sometimes in school we have somebody who might be called a pre-junior. Where do you put them in that scheme if you're doing sophomores and seniors and that type of evaluation? And for something like income level, how are you going to find people who are in a certain income level? That means that you have that knowledge available. You don't always have it. So here they're showing 12 observations chosen randomly from the general population. That's the top rectangle. Now they've split that into freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, and they picked 3 from each one. And the little X's that you see in there are the ones they picked. So they got 12 observations total each time, but they did it in 2 different ways. On the bottom one, they actually have clusters within the school, and they've actually picked 3 clusters, and from each cluster picked 4. So all 3 cases, they have 12 observations total. So you can pause this and look at the comparison, advantages, etc. Retrospective study looks in the past, prospective study looks in the future, and they're both observational. So a case control, we want to look at something. A lot of times these are medical studies, and it's not practical or ethical to perform an experiment. For instance, for lung cancer. The cases all have lung cancer, the controls don't. So we start with these cases who had lung cancer. It turns out out of 709 of them, 688 were smokers. 20 of them weren't. And we look at the controls, and we picked randomly from the general population by some method. We picked 709 of them, and we said, how many of you smoked? How many of you don't? You notice in the cases for lung cancer, 97% of them smoked. In the cases where there's no lung cancer, 92% of them smoked. And so this is retrospective because you can look in the past and find things like this that you're not going forward with this type of thing. So there's a nurse's health study. It gives you the numbers here, ages, how frequently the questions were. And what it is trying to point out here is this is a prospective study that they're going forward, they're following into nurses as time goes on. So it's one associated with the future. Here they repeat that retrospective versus prospective. Sample survey is intended to take a cross-section of a population at the current time. Sample surveys are sometimes called cross-sectional studies. So they're trying to do a cross-sectional study of what the general population is interested in say as a political candidate, what type of burger is popular, whatever it might happen to be you're trying to gather data about. So you can never definitively establish causation with an observational study. You can't really do it with an experiment, but it's a stronger one. It's a stronger causation link, is what we would think of it as. So as more studies are done that adjust for confounding variables, the chance that the lurking variable remains is reduced. So if it's a well-designed experiment, you have less problems with that. Multi-factor experiments are pretty interesting to do. So you may actually have several factors. So suppose I gave a medication versus no medication. But I can also give a medication at different levels, like 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, or 15 versus no medication. I could give a medication of one type and a medication of another. And that's done quite often because sometimes one medication works okay, another one works okay, but together they actually work better than you might expect. So here's the example for that. One factor is using a nicotine patch. The other one is using something called bupropion. So in the upper left, it's showing using, someone gets both of them. On the right, they only get the drug, they don't get the nicotine patch. Below, they don't get either. So they have all combinations. So that's two factors, two treatments. So when you do matched pairs, subjects can cross over. That's one type of matched pair. If you have something like twins, it's ideal. You give one something, like a medication, the other one doesn't get it, and neither knows who got what. That's a matched pair that's great, but hard to find a lot of twins to do this with. So if you can actually switch over halfway through, so the pills look the same, perhaps one gets the placebo, one doesn't, halfway through, you switch it, and maybe this is something that is meant to reduce migraine headaches, something like that. So halfway through you switch who's getting what and see how many migraine headaches are reported during the time period. Like you might do 6 months with one, then switch over and do 6 months with the second one. So blocks we went over a little bit before, and we're done for this one.